Over the past few months, you've likely heard the word recession pop up a lot in the media. It's a scary word. With record inflation and consumer sentiment, the stock market selling off, and continued supply-side shocks for everyday items like baby formula, oil, and chicken, the fears of a recession have gone up dramatically. In fact, a recent survey by CNBC found that 83% of employed adults are worried about a recession, making it the biggest near-term concern and beating out worries over wages, COVID, pay cuts, and layoffs. It's clear that an impending recession is at the top of mind for most Americans, but should you be worrying too? Before we dive into this, let's first go over what exactly a recession even is. According to Investopedia, a recession refers to a significant decline in general economic activity in a designated region. It is typically measured as 2 consecutive quarters of economic decline, which is reflected by gross domestic product, or GDP, in conjunction with monthly economic indicators such as a rise in unemployment. GDP is the monetary value of all the finished goods and services made within a country. Changes in GDP over quarters provide us with a decent understanding of just how the economy is doing. While consecutive quarters of GDP decline is the generally accepted definition of a recession, the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, which is tasked with declaring what an official recession starts or ends, they define a recession as a significant decline in economic activity spread across the economy, lasting more than a few months. They'll also use real GDP, real income growth, employment, industrial production, and wholesale retail sales to gauge whether we're officially in a recession. If you like this video and want to see more of our content, hit subscribe right now. We'd really appreciate it. Now, some recessions are mild, economic activity declines, and unemployment rises, but the economy quickly recovers. For instance, the COVID recession in 2020 was super quick, right? Only lasted a few months. Other recessions, on the other hand, such as the 18-month 2007 to 2009 downturn, often referred to as the Great Recession, wreaked widespread havoc on millions of people's financial lives before economic growth resumed. And according to the NBER, there have been 34 recessions since 1853. This means that there is a recession almost every 5 years on average. What's the takeaway? You'll probably live through many recessions in your lifetime. And if there is a recession during the next year, it won't be the last, most likely. Fortunately, even though recessions are common, they're not permanent. To date, every single recession in the US has recovered eventually. According to their research, recessions between 1945 and 2009 only lasted about 11 months on average before recovering. That's not very long, especially if you're investing and saving for the long run. An economic recovery is when an economy rebounds from the decline in economic growth and begins to regain the losses. Economic recoveries could take anywhere from months to years. And according to the University of Chicago, each additional year of economic boom leading up to the downturn could delay the eventual economic recovery by 2.5 months. Given that the last recession the US experienced was just 2 years ago, maybe this means that the next recession, if it happens soon, could have a relatively quick recovery. Are we in a recession now even? Well, in the first quarter of 2022, we saw negative growth in GDP when compared to the previous quarter. This was the first quarterly decline in GDP growth since the second quarter of 2020, when the pandemic first started. We'll get an estimate about Q2 GDP from the government later in July of 2022, but by then, we should have a better idea if a recession is even coming. And I know many of you are likely curious about what's happening to the markets and how much lower it could potentially go. Since World War II, there have been 12 recessions. During these recessions, the S&P 500 index declined by a median of 24% and an average of 30% from peak to trough. That means for us right now, a decline of 24% from the S&P 500 peak of about 4,800 in early 22 would bring the S&P 500 down to about 3,650, and a 30% decline would reduce the S&P 500 to 3,360. And who knows? There may be some more pain to come, but that's all speculative in nature. I know this can be extremely painful and may discourage you from putting more money into the market, but hold off from moving forward with that thoughts until after this video. But here's an analogy that can hopefully change the way you think about a market that just refuses to go up. Let's say you love Cinnamon Toast Crunch, and you buy a box of it every week or so at the grocery store. If that cereal went on sale for a few weeks, months, or even years, chances are you'd be happy about it. This makes intuitive sense, but investors sometimes have trouble applying the same logic to stocks when they're on sale. If you believe that the market will eventually rebound, I personally do, and it historically has, that's what history shows us, you can think of stocks as being on sale, just like that Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Man, I miss that cereal. Using this logic, it's actually a good thing when the market is temporarily down, because assuming you have a long-term time horizon, let's say 3+ years, you can buy investments at a more reasonable price right now. In fact, you can actually come out ahead when you invest consistently in a declining market compared to investing in a steadily rising one. The most popular way of taking advantage of this knowledge is through dollar cost averaging, which means investing a set amount of money on a schedule, like $100 a week or $500 a month. That way, you don't have to worry about picking the right time to invest. You'll just buy investments at a range of prices over time. And then during a recession, some of those prices are bound to be lower. But whatever you do, just do not sell your investments. According to CNBC, when looking at data going back to 1930, it was found that if an investor missed the S&P 500's 10 best days each decade, the total return would stand at only 28% over that time. On the other hand, if the investor held steadily through the ups and downs and didn't sell off, the return would have been 17,715%. So while watching your investments drop day after day, selling out of the market brings the risk of locking in and then realizing your losses. It's crucial to stay invested because historically, the best days in the market follow the worst days relatively quickly, and it's truly impossible to perfectly time the market. All right, so now we know that our investment portfolios should be okay in the long run. What are some things that we can start doing right now to prepare for a recession if it does come? Before doing anything else, it's important that you get rid of as much credit card debt as possible. With a recession potentially on the way and interest rates rising, it's even more important to tackle your debt. A common question that we get when discussing paying off debt is whether to invest or pay off debt. This is a great question, and it's super important that we talk about this before going into anything else. The discussion about whether to invest or whether to pay off debt has long been ongoing, and there's frankly no real right answer. To start off, if you have debt that's weighing on your mind, it can be tempting to just throw chunks of cash at your largest outstanding balance and do anything you can to make the number less scary. Sometimes this is a good way to go, but it's not always the case. Depending on the interest rates associated with your debts, opting to invest the extra cash instead of paying down on the lower interest loan could actually save you more in the long run. Here's our rule of thumb. Pay off higher interest debts with an after-tax interest rate that is higher than the likely return on your investments. Credit cards tend to have higher interest rates, whereas some student loans will have lower interest rates than the likely returns on an investment. Take a look at your specific debts and then go from there. For example, according to creditcards.com, the average credit card interest rate is around 17%. On the other hand, federal student loan rates are around 4%. We also know that the S&P 500 has returned an annualized average return of around 10.5% since 1957. Based on our rule of thumb of paying off debts with interest rates higher than the average return on an investment, it would probably be a good idea to work on aggressively paying off your credit card debt while still paying the minimum amounts for your student loans. And while we can make these rules or guidelines, there is undoubtedly an emotional component to debt and paying off debt. For some people, just holding any debt will bring emotional burdens. If debt is affecting your overall peace of mind dramatically, then the specifics of interest rate versus returns or returns versus interest rates doesn't matter here. Pay off that debt. However, if you are not rattled with holding some debt, then run the numbers and see what the best option is. Sometimes with low interest debt, keeping it and investing the extra money is sometimes smarter. Now that we've talked about debt and investing, here are some other things you can do to prepare for a recession. One important but a simple thing that comes to mind is to make sure you have a good emergency fund and a high yield savings account. A survey by Bankrate found that 25% of Americans do not have any emergency savings whatsoever. If you're part of this 25%, start building out an emergency fund now. That way, if there are any unforeseen costs like car repairs, medical treatments, or even losing your job during a recession, you have a cushion that can help reduce the burden of emergency expenses. And since recessions often mean higher unemployment numbers, now is a good time to make sure you have an adequate emergency fund. For most people, This means holding enough cash in reserve to cover 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses. Now, the right amount for your specific situation will depend on your age, profession, investable assets, and your extended family's financial needs. But it's wise to hold your emergency fund in a high-yield account like the Wealthfront Cash Account with a 1.40 APY, no market risk, and 4 times the FDIC insured offered by a traditional bank account. It's a safe place to put your emergency funds to grow. Having a good emergency fund can give you some peace of mind. If you're concerned that you might be affected by layoffs, you'll probably sleep better at night knowing that you have enough cash to cover your bills until you find a new job. Okay, so you probably know that having an emergency fund is important, but how can you contribute more to that fund? The answer is having a realistic budget and sticking to that budget. Ideally, you can try using the 50-30-20 rule to set a basic budget. Now, the 50-30-20 budget simply means allocating 50% to necessities, 30% to wants or discretionary spending, and 20% to savings and investments. If you're already following a budget similar to this, that's great, congratulations. But if you do not have a budget set yet, the 50-30-20 budget is a great starter to try. Here's an example of this 50-30-20 in action. Let's say you make $100,000 after taxes and withholdings. Assuming you get paid twice per month, you take home about $4,167 every other week. Based on the 50-30-20, you should allocate $2,083 to needs, $1,250 to wants, and $833 to savings and investments. Now let's say you're already following that 50-30-20 budget and you're doing well with sticking to it. A good challenge to try is to reduce the percentage allocated to discretionary spending and increase the allocation to savings and investments. So maybe instead of the 30% to discretionary spending and 20% to savings and investments, try 25% to discretionary spending and 25% to savings and investments. Then over time, you can increase your savings rate. I'm Tony from Wealthfront. Take care.